things that I've been teaching my patients about how to control their blood pressure, their weight, and a lot of other things that seem to be connected to the sugars that we eat in our diet. And I've been teaching this over the last 20 plus years, and I wanted to take the advantage of this format to be able to put into your hands an easy way to understand glycemic index and how that can affect your health in a real positive way by making a few simple changes in your diet. And so what I'm going to do with this hangout is to go over some of the basic definitions of what the glycemic index is. I'm going to go over a few graphs that describe what is going on in your body in terms of blood sugar and insulin and other parts of the body that are affected by blood sugars that are changing rapidly. And in the end, I'm going to apply some simple eating strategies that you can do starting today that will start to turn your health around if you decide to follow these strategies. So first of all, in talking about the glycemic index, this refers basically to foods that are carbohydrates. Now, as you know, the major foods that we eat, the so-called macronutrients, are divided into three large groups. One is the fats, the second is the proteins, and the third, the carbohydrates. Now, the simplest way to understand carbohydrates is basically to understand that they are strings of sugar molecules that are stuck together in various ways, and these sugar molecules can be broken apart through the digestive process and absorbed into our bloodstream. So we know that certain foods are more easily broken down than others, and research in the 80s and 90s really started to hone in on what exactly happens to the blood sugar with specific foods exactly. So we had known for years, well, decades, that some foods raise the blood sugar rapidly and others don't, but in general, how much they did, really that wasn't nailed down till the late 80s and 90s, and much of that research was done by the University of Sydney in Australia, and I still consider them the gold standard. Now I mention that because actually in the 1990s it was easier to get a clear understanding of the glycemic index of various foods than it is now, because you have people of a lot of different perspectives, different research centers that are publishing their own research, and sometimes you'll see numbers that refer to the glycemic index of, say, bread or potatoes that are very different from one place compared to the other. And in general, I would recommend that you look at the University of Sydney's information as being the gold standard on what is the real glycemic index of different foods. Now, as I said, glycemic index really refers to foods that raise the blood sugar rapidly, and so that can only refer to carbohydrates. So fats and proteins are broken down in the body much more slowly and turned into a fuel source much more slowly. So when we refer to glycemic index, we're referring to basically carbohydrates. Now, some carbohydrates are easy to digest, such as potatoes. Other carbohydrates are impossible for humans to digest, such as grass and trees. So if you gnawed on a tree or some grass, the chances are your blood sugar would not change because we can't digest it. So even though there are sugar molecules locked up in those substances, we can't digest them. But on the other hand, there are foods that we can digest very quickly, and on the top end of that spectrum are foods like potatoes. So I'm going to show you just a simple diagram here, or not a diagram, but a list of foods relative to each other to give you a sense of where things kind of stack up in this glycemic index concept. So at the top is glucose, at the bottom is water. So obviously water doesn't have any calories, and so the glycemic index of water would be 0. You'll notice that I've divided this into basically 30, 60, and to 100. So below 30 is generally low glycemic. Between 30 and 60, at least in older strategies, would have been called mid-glycemic, and then above that would be high glycemic. Now, as I said, you're going to be seeing some confusing information out there as far as what is mid-glycemic versus high glycemic. Some people use 50 versus 60, and I'm going to basically be talking to you in terms of relative numbers. So in a sense, those differences don't matter that much. It's the basic concepts that I want you to understand to get across with this training today. So what is basically in the lowest group, 30 and below, are the vegetables. And so vegetables are digestible, but very slowly. So the body can turn those sugar molecules that are locked up in the vegetable to blood sugar slowly. And so when you eat a low glycemic food, what happens is the blood sugar rises slowly. Generally, the fruits are in this middle range. Now, there are some exceptions. Some of the fruits, especially the melons, are up in this higher range, but most of the fruits are in the mid-range, and that might be surprising that they actually are lower than some of these other foods because they taste sweet. But the thing is that they have a different sugar, and that sugar is called fructose, which has to be digested into glucose or changed into glucose, and that's why it's a little bit lower glycemic. It takes longer for the blood sugar to rise from fructose. So that's why the fruits are in this middle range. And then up here we have the grains, rice and potatoes, and then of course sugar. So those are the foods that tend to raise the blood sugar the most rapidly. So we call those high glycemic foods. So the scale goes all the way down from foods that really raise the blood sugar slowly to things that raise the blood sugar very rapidly. In fact, potatoes, you'll see, are almost at 100. They're about 90 to 95 if they're hot and well baked or mashed. And they'll actually raise the blood sugar faster than a candy bar, because a candy bar tends to be a combination of not just easily digested carbs, but it's also got some protein and some fats in it. So I'll talk about this concept and what to do about it a little bit later again. But to give you more of an image of what's going on in the body when you consume a high glycemic meal or food, this little graph shows you both blood sugar and insulin in response to meal times. And what you'll see, of course, is that at the meal time, the blood sugar shoots up, and then as the body senses the blood sugar shooting up, it pumps out a lot of insulin, and you'll see that tracking along, the insulin signal tracking along with the blood sugar. And as the blood sugar gets to a certain level, enough insulin gets pumped out to turn it around, and the blood sugar starts to drop. Now, as the blood sugar starts to drop, most people start to feel hungry. And what they're hungry for are, you guessed it, more high glycemic foods. So they'll eat another typically high glycemic meal, and we'll start the roller coaster again. The blood sugar goes up quickly, and then the insulin again follows quickly. And this roller coaster of blood sugar going up and then coming down quickly in response to this real big surge of insulin is unfortunately the average American diet, and in some countries the average Western diet. And because of this condition, it takes the toll on the body, because the body was not designed to have this kind of a blood sugar surge meal after meal, day after day, month after month, and year after year. It starts to pay a price for that, because the insulin levels start to affect the insulin receptors in a way that they don't listen to the insulin quite as well. And so what that leads to is this condition that we call insulin resistance. So you'll see that the graph is very similar in this one. The blood sugar shoots up rapidly at mealtime. The insulin shoots up rapidly to try to keep the blood sugar within a range that the body considers normal. But what you'll see that's different here is that the insulin level is a lot higher than it was in this one. So, of course, these are all relative numbers, but In this one, the insulin is sort of tracking along the blood sugar. In this one, the insulin surges well past where it used to be, and we call this insulin resistance. So insulin resistance is where the receptors on the cells that are responsible for basically opening that cell up for the blood sugar to come in aren't working well. And it's a little bit like trying to walk into a room that the door is really rusty. And so you have to push hard to open the door up. The door will open with enough pressure, but it's harder. And so the body's version of pushing harder with hormones is that it puts out a higher level of the hormone. So essentially, the body is finding that the receptor is resistant to the signal, so it puts out a louder signal. It's like shouting hormonally. And again, the goal for the body, as far as the body's system is concerned, it's just trying to keep the blood sugar from going too high. And so this condition of insulin resistance will keep going on for usually years and years. Usually it's kind of underneath the surface. Most people don't feel it. They will start to feel some of the conditions that develop from that, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. And then eventually, left to a person left to their own devices, the chances are that they will progress to diabetes. Now, this is what you'll see that's different about this graph. You'll see that the blood sugar still surges at mealtime. You still see that the insulin resistance is going on. But you'll notice here that the blood sugar now, the starting point, is at a higher point than in this graph. You'll see that the starting point was low here, the so-called normal on this graph. And on this graph now, the blood sugar starting point is already higher than normal. So what happened here is after years and years and years of this insulin resistance, eventually the body maxes out on how much insulin it can pump out when it needs to be keeping the blood sugar under check. And as it pumps out its maximum amount of insulin, and then the insulin resistance continues to worsen, finally the blood sugar starts to rise outside of normal levels. You'll also notice that in this particular graph, the blood sugar starts out high, it rises higher, but then it drops fast too in response to the insulin signal. So for most type 2 diabetics, which are diabetics that do not have insulin deficiency, they have insulin resistance, there'll be a time when they'll actually be frankly diabetic, but still have spells where they feel hypoglycemic, and that's because the blood sugar is dropping rapidly. And as the blood sugar drops rapidly, it gives the perception that there's not enough sugar in the system. Even though the sugar may be well within normal limits, if it's dropping rapidly, the body perceives that as low blood sugar. So you'll still feel really hungry there, eat another high glycemic meal, and up it goes again with the same problem. Insulin resistance is still going on. In other words, the body has not exhausted its ability to pump out insulin. It's just maxed out its ability to pump out insulin. Now, if this condition continues for a long time, eventually these insulin levels are going to start dropping because, indeed, the pancreas does get pooped out and it just stops making as much insulin as it used to. There's a lot of other hormones involved in this, but this is really the major player in this whole issue of insulin resistance syndrome, moving on to diabetes, which is what we're seeing here. Now, insulin resistance is an interesting concept because it causes so many things, and the reason that I'm focusing on this glycemic index instruction is because, in a sense, insulin resistance is the core for many of the diseases that plague us